So I'm here today with Hal Coopersmith of Coopersmith and Coopersmith. He's a real estate attorney in New York City, and the surrounding area, focusing on residential, commercial, leasing and sales. He's also developed a pretty cool tool for landlords to use in tracking the newest laws and making sure that all your I's are dotted and T's are crossed. So Hal, tell me kind of, what you're up to.
So, Russ, that's a good question. Last summer, New York State enacted the Housing Stability and Tenant Protection Act, and it enacted a lot of requirements for residential landlords, some of which you probably heard. For example, a security deposit is limited to 1 month's rent. A late fee is capped at $50, and you can't collect more than 1 month's rent in advance. So you can no longer collect the first and last month's rent, or even for tenants who want to pay a year's worth of rent. If you ever get that lucky, you can no longer collect a full year's rent. But there are a lot of requirements that a lot of people are not talking about for landlords, and specific deadlines. If landlords don't follow these deadlines, they can really wind up in a lot of trouble at the end of their lease.
Okay. So talk to us. If I'm a residential unit owner in Manhattan, let's say, okay, and I chose to buy it as an investment originally, or I relocated, whatever it is, I hold this unit now as an investment, I rent it out. What are those things that I'm looking at?
It's a good question, because there are a lot of pitfalls if you aren't aware of the law. And so what I say is that renting an apartment just isn't as simple as writing a lease and collecting rent. And a lease used to be, you write the landlord's name, the tenant's name, security deposit, and rent, and you're basically done. But what happened with the law that was enacted last year is it requires landlords to send out a notice either 30, 60, or 90 days before the end of the lease if they are going to increase the rent by more than 5%. And that's extremely important if you're discounting your rent in New York City right now, just because you probably have a better handle of this. There are more rental concessions. Or if the lease is going to expire. And that's also important, just as you brought up, if you're in a co-op and there's a rental restriction, even if it's a 2-year lease and the co-op has a restriction on 2 years, you still have to send this notice to inform the tenant that the lease is going to expire. So that's one of the first things to know. And it's 30, 60, or 90 days, depending on how long the tenant has been in the premises. So it's 30 days if the tenant has been there less than a year, 60 days for a year to up to 2 years, and then 90 days for 2 years or more. In addition, you have to offer the tenant a walkthrough in a 1-week window before the end of the term. And that window is 2 weeks before the lease expires and 1 week before the lease expires. And the law says that you have to offer that walkthrough on 48 hours notice to the tenant, just to show, to see if there are any damages to the premises and offer them an opportunity to fix them. And then the final requirement is you have to return your security deposit within 2 weeks from the end of the term. And one of the things that I didn't mention, which is certainly relevant to you, is in terms of whether or not a tenant has to pay a brokerage commission, or a tenant, whether a broker can collect a brokerage commission from a tenant. Right now, that was in interpretation of the law. That's going back to court. It's scheduled to go back in September.
Yeah, brokers like to get paid commissions.
Yes, and so it's important, because this is a interpretation of the law, and if it's not coming from the tenant, no one's saying that a broker can't collect commissions. It just has to come from the landlord.
Got it. Right, but there has been some change, or not change, but there's been some interpretation of that, as you said, is being worked on through September.
Right, exactly. So the law passed by the New York State Legislature last summer, and interpretation of that law, a regulation from New York State, affected commissions. That's being challenged by the Real Estate Board of New York, among other parties as well.
Got it. Okay. And so, as you mentioned, you've developed a software that helps these individual landlords, even landlords that own more than one unit, to navigate through these terms. Tell us something about that.
Yeah, well, thank you for bringing that up. It's a software called ResCue, REZCUE, Res for residential, Q for email and text alerts, and Rescue for saving landlords from noncompliance with the law. And what this software does is it sends email and text messages to the owner of the property, together with a broker such as yourself or a property manager, a couple of other different parties, 45, 30, and 15 days in advance of the first deadline that I talked about, the one that's, depending on how long the tenant has been in the premises. And then if the lease, so that you and broker and the owner can kind of get together and determine, do we want to renew this tenant? Do we want to search for someone else? Are we going to raise the rent by more than 5%? Are we going to sell this property and do we want it vacant? So it brings all the parties together on the same page, just in terms of figuring out what to do with the property next. And then if you're not going to renew the tenant, we send out another sequence of cues to remind the landlord and their trusted advisor about the walkthrough and scheduling that with the tenant. And then finally, we remind the owner to return the security deposit within 2 weeks from the end of the term, which is an important requirement.
And who are the types of people that are your clients?
So for ResCue specifically, this applies to any landlord within New York State, because it's a New York State law, and trying to get people to use this software and make sure that they're in compliance with the law. In terms of our practice at our law firm of Coopersmith and Coopersmith, we do a lot of residential work. We've done some high-end residential leasing, and we've also done commercial leasing as well. And so one of the things I realized about residential leasing from commercial leasing is there are a lot more follow-up and integration with our client in terms of what we were doing on the commercial end that's now a part of residential. And like I said earlier, residential leasing just isn't simply writing a lease, collecting rent, and making sure the tenant leaves on time. There's a lot more requirements on landlords right now, and I'm very passionate about educating landlords and brokers in the real estate community to say there's a lot more of the things you need to do, and if you don't do them, the tenant can stay on the same terms and conditions on the lease, even though the lease is expired, until they get that notice sent. So that, if you can imagine, in terms of what you're doing, that can really goof up a sale or the next rental coming in. And so it's extremely important for landlords to know about this. Sure.
So you're doing a lot of different things in the space around real estate, and working on the management software side now, and you're doing resi and commercial legal work. What are you seeing out there in the market?
Well, for that, I'm kind of relying on trusted people like you in terms of the market. But in New York City, certainly prices and rents aren't where they once were on residential. On commercial, the same thing, and particularly for commercial and residential, a lot of concessions coming down the pipe, particularly on the higher end.
Okay, so there's no doubt that's going to happen, at least in this moment. What are you seeing as far as activity? And be specific, I think, in the last 3 months versus the last 2 weeks.
Well, you're right. I mean, in the beginning, on the residential side, for us, it was the deals that we were working on were people who had seen properties before COVID and willing to work through those transactions. Now, as things have opened up, there's more activity in residential, not so much on the commercial side, but do see an uptick in activity, just not in the same way that it once was, particularly in New York City. A lot of activity outside New York City for folks, for rentals and for purchases and sales.
Sure. So, but just drilling down here a little deeper, because I think the audience is curious. I'm actually curious myself as well. We were allowed to start showing again last Monday. So have you seen an uptick in contracts and leases coming in since last Monday?
In terms of our sliver of the universe within New York City. Haven't seen a major uptick. I'm sure from your perspective, a lot of people don't necessarily want to set the market right off the bat, and it depends on the individual circumstances. But from our general perspective, and again, our sliver of the universe, haven't seen a major flow in just because showings opened up last Monday.
Yeah, it's interesting. Our activity has picked up a lot, and it probably started 10 days before phase 2 was opening. We got a lot more inquiries on listings, a lot more buyers sort of coming out, a lot of people that watch these videos that we send out that have been reaching out with more transaction-sided questions than we've had in the past. But the contracts aren't yet there. So you're right about setting this market. It's going to be interesting to see how it flows through.
Yeah, and I've actually seen people who, surprisingly enough, were planning to purchase in August, September, and kind of making accommodations for that, and reaching out and kind of figuring that out a few months away.
Got it. Okay. So thank you, Hal, for joining us today.
Thank you, Russell. It's been a pleasure to be here. And if people want to learn more about our ResQ software, they can go to rezqme.com. That's RezQueme.com. And for more about our firm, you can go to Coopersmith and Coopersmith.com.
Awesome. And if you like these videos and the information that we're getting out there, please subscribe to our YouTube page at Focus Reg, and follow us on Instagram at FocusReg. Thanks, everyone. We'll see you next week.